The Supreme Self, which alone is the truth, is right in the middle between the inert and the intelligence. That alone creates diversity and is known by all these diverse names. So the Supreme Self creates diversity and then becomes known by all these diverse names. The Supreme Self creates diversity by means of the cognitive process, by means of concepts and percepts. But all these categories have been invented by men of perverse intellect for the pleasure of polemics and for the confusion of ignorant men. Well, I don't think that's their purpose. Spiritually, that's the result. And we want to detach ourselves, dissociate ourselves from this process if we're interested in spiritual understanding. But I don't think we should dismiss it so readily. It's what allows us to create tools. It's what's given us art and science. It's what allows us to improve our physical, material conditions. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself. We too tend to forget the deeper reality as a result. And this does lead to not just the pleasure of polemics, but the pleasure of intellectualization and the confusion of ignorant men. We really do tend to believe in the reality of our own notions. We have no problem with seeing religious extremists or fundamentalists as being deluded. They believe in the truth. Well, they feel with such conviction the truth of their own beliefs. It's just their beliefs, their notions. And most of us can see that that's a rather extreme thing, believing in the absolute truth of your own notions, of your own convictions. It's quite scary. But we all do that to some extent. We've got our notions which aren't expressed in terms of religious dogma, perhaps. We've got notions that science is basically true, for example, that we're made up of atoms and molecules. We've got absolutely no experience of this, but we're told this is so by scientists, and scientists have given us technology, and technology works. But a good scientist, a true scientist, would not say that science is giving you truth. It's giving you a deeper understanding, perhaps, which allows you to manipulate the physical world, the material world. Science gives us really good stories for that. It gives us good stories for making sense of the world. But what's truth? What's truth? These stories change. The stories within science change. No scientist would seriously say that an atom is made up of a miniature solar system. But that's one way of explaining the atom. It's much more complicated than that. Or we can have much more complicated stories about it. Anyway, so we've got all these categories, and we get identified with these categories, and we start believing that they're true. But they're not true, it's all provisional. They're all stories which help us to make sense of the world and to find our way around. They're stories which can be empowering to a certain extent. But for spiritual understanding, we need to understand their nature as stories and stop investing them with truth. Thus, O Ram, it is this Jiva alone which is the cause of this world appearance. What can this deaf and dumb body do? So this Jiva is the mind, it's the individual, it's the mind which identifies with its own notions. If the body perishes, the self does not perish. Even as if a leaf falls, the tree does not perish. Only the deluded person thinks otherwise. Well, this might seem like a conjecture, and we're not interested in conjectures. But if you've touched your own awareness with your own awareness, then it doesn't have any qualities. It doesn't have any qualities. You can't even say whether it's alive or dead, or whether it exists or it doesn't exist. So we can't really describe it as perishable either. On the other hand, if the mind perishes, everything perishes, and there is final liberation. And the mind here is the cognitive process. Once the momentum of that cognitive process weakens, then we're becoming, well, it only weakens when we're established in a liberated condition, when we realize the nature of our own awareness. And we stop believing, we stop feeling this urge to cling to our own notions about things. The man who wails, "I am dying, I perish," is foolishly clinging to a false concept. He goes on experiencing the world illusion in some other place or time. The Jiva that dwells in mental conditioning abandons one body and goes looking for another, even as a monkey abandons one tree in a forest and jumps on to another. Thereafter, in a moment, it abandons that too and seeks yet another, in another part of space and in another period of time. Just as a nanny takes the baby from one place to another in order to distract it, this mental conditioning, or the psychological habit or tendency, takes the Jiva here and there. Thus, tied to the rope of mental conditioning, the Jiva goes through repeated birth in various species, enduring interminable suffering. As the sage Vasishta said this, another day came to an end, and the assembly dispersed for their evening prayers. So, I mean, this is one way of looking at it. This restless attention, perhaps it stops when the body dies, but within the Eastern traditions there's no reason to assume that it stops. And in our modern times where everything gets recycled, even our body parts get recycled, even if they're burnt to ash and all the moisture is put into air, it all goes back. Nothing ever completely stops. And just as when we're fast asleep, our mind, our attention is still continuously flitting here and there, there's no reason for it not to continue flitting after death. This is conjecture, and it's one way of looking at things. But is the attention material? Is the mind and our thoughts material? Why shouldn't they all get recycled, taken on a new body and all the rest of it? And in fact, given that awareness does take on new bodies, we see that all the time. It's in you, it's in people round about, in dogs and insects, all that life going on. They've all got their own versions of awareness, which are fundamentally non-different in the same way that space is non-different. So it really does make perfect sense just to assume that this awareness is carrying on all the time, because that's what it's doing anyway. Whether it's attached to notions of one individual or another, it doesn't really matter. And this theme carries on in the next chapter.